This week, I'm trimming the bowl that you saw me throw in my previous video, as well as discussing some tools that were recently sent to me by an enterprising young potter named Kamil Janawa. Now, since receiving these, I have found out some more information about where the Tungsten Carbide blade blanks are sourced, and for transparency's sake, I need to talk about it. But I'll do that towards the end of this beginning segment. Kamil is only 18 years old, and the pots he's producing for that age really are rather remarkable. Technically, they're far beyond anything I was making at that age, and he's enterprising as he started to make tools that fill a gap in the market. The legendary trimmers by Phil Poberka can be almost impossible to obtain these days, but lately a new group of tungsten carbide toolmakers have sprung up to fill the hole that was in the market, links to which I'll leave down in the description below. And whilst Phil paved the way in making tools like this, there is simply no way he'd ever keep up with the demand that's worldwide for these types of tools nowadays. Anyway, back to Kamil's tools. He specifically asked for feedback on these, and in this video, that's exactly what I'm going to do. It may be quite honest, but I think it will lead to an interesting discussion about what it is I'm looking for in tools like this, and what makes good trimmers versus those which aren't quite so good. Off the bat, these feel great. Kamil is turning the handles for these himself. Yet, as for the blades, as far as I'm aware, due to the complex nature of creating such things, he sources the tungsten carbide blades in the rough, sharpens them, and inserts them. And that's where the conversation gets relatively interesting, as you can, if you go online, quite easily find blades that have the exact same dimensions. You can find them attached to tools, and already sharpened, and you can even find the blanks themselves that are yet to be sharpened, at really cheap prices. A few days ago I posted about these tools on Instagram, and a potter and toolmaker left an interesting comment saying that these blanks are in fact his original designs. He started to have them produced in China, and since then the company he had a deal with has gone on to just sell them publicly. Alexander actually sent me the tool on the right years ago, and you can see, when they're placed side by side, that they are identical. There are even small circles left on the tools from the casting process on both of these, in the exact same places, which means that the designs that Alexander had created are now being used and sold to, well, anyone. And once you notice this, you'll start to see these exact same shapes everywhere. And I suppose that's presumably what happened with Kamil. He found the blade roughs online for cheap, purchased them, sharpened them, turned handles for them, and started his own enterprise making tools, which isn't a bad idea considering there's definitely a market for it. But since finding all of this out, it will make me look at the market a bit differently, and it makes those who are actually making the blades themselves really stand out. But for Kamil, this is a start, I suppose, and for the most part they are very sharp. The lathe handles are comfortable, but the only thing I'm not keen on is all the visible epoxy resin on show at the top, keeping the blade held in snugly, compared to the one that was gifted to me by Alexander of Ovo Ceramics, which has a neater metal ferrule the blade slots into, or, like those others you may have seen more recently on my channel, made by Rami of RD Pottery Tools. Again, I'll add links to all of these tool makers down in the video's description. Anyway, back to Kamil's tools. They do feel sturdy, but the metal ferrules in places are a bit rough. And the handles themselves, whilst turned to a nice shape, are just a touch too varnished for my liking. On the good side, they are wickedly sharp in places. The tip of this hook tool, in particular, is especially lethal. Anyway, that's enough of a ramble. For Kamil's age, he's doing a wonderful job creating pots and tools. I think in 5 or 10 years' time it will be fascinating to see what he's up to. I wish I had the talent he does when I was only 18 years old. So, the best way to test these is going to be to trim a pot with them.
Jiro, speak. Good boy. Good boy.
And the subject of this test will be the stepped bowl with a very narrow foot you may have seen me throw in last week's video. I'll be only using these for the majority of the turning, but I'll also be using some cheap steel trimmers to do jobs that these tungsten carbide ones just can't do, as they have some limitations. The bowl itself is the perfect state of leather hard. It's slightly cold to the touch, but it no longer marks easily or deforms as I touch it, which is vital for when you're turning pots, especially with tungsten carbide tools, as they're honestly useless when used on soft clay, as the sharp blade just sinks into the material. You want the clay to be firm enough to have some resistance to it, enough so it can hold its shape. The first thing I'm going to do is center the bowl and check to see if the rim is wavering at all, which I do by looking in the mirror in front of me. If I see that the rim at this point is wobbling up and down, I'd have to take some measures to correct that. But this piece is actually looking really good, so I take some slip and brush it onto the wheel. Then the bowl is placed down onto this, tap-centered, which I often do with my left hand on the inside pushing down. This way I can apply downward pressure to pin the pot in place when it's in the right spot. And lastly, I just seal the base with a plastic kidney. Now for turning the inside of this pot, I'm only going to be using the steel tools. Due to the angle the tools have to be held for the blade to slice through the clay, compared to the tungsten blades which tend to be thicker and have more of a beveled cutting edge. But I'll chat more about that when it comes time to hollow out the footwell. But for the time being, all I'm doing is trimming a nice curve on this inside surface, which I then smooth over with this very sharp metal kidney. Next, it's the turn of the step portion inside the rim, for which I've got to hold the tool at a very strange angle. I clasp it firmly with my right hand whilst resting it in my left, and then I use one of the smaller steel blades just to burnish and neaten up these surfaces. To get rid of the turnings inside, I use a length of soft clay, like a sponge or a magnet of sorts, to fish out all the tiny shards. And now, on the outside, I can start to use the tungsten carbide tools. This outer portion of the rim is almost too dry to trim with conventional tools, but tungsten carbide is wonderful at removing clay when it is in this drier state. With these you can also turn pots that are bone dry or even bisque fired, yet the amount of dust that produces really isn't worth it, unless you want to be hunched over the wheel with a mask on. I think this smaller blade would be better for this area. This blade in particular is very sharp, and as it's smaller, and I can apply pressure to a smaller surface area, it chatters much less than the larger blades. Chattering, by the way, is what we call it when the blade bounces slightly on the surface as you trim. If done intentionally, it can leave a lovely patterned surface, but it can also be one of the challenging things to overcome when you're learning to use tungsten carbide tools, as they're just so prone to it. Often I trim and I let it happen to some degree, and then I'll scrape back over those areas with a steel turning tool or just a flat metal kidney. With the inside and stepped portion turned, I can switch my focus to the underside of the pot, which is the area that requires the most trimming, especially as I left so much material in the foot itself. Purposefully, mind you, as I want this bowl to sit on a tall, elegant foot that's completely hollow. So I set the bowl delicately on its rim, and at this point I'm centering the line above the rim, not the rim itself, as there is for some reason just a slight sway in the lip of the pot. To secure it in place, I press 3 lumps of soft clay around the rim, and I don't push these towards the pot. Instead I press them downward, letting the clay that splays out be the material that holds the bowl in place. I say this as if you push these lugs into the rim, you can really easily distort the shape of the pot itself, if it is quite thin or the material soft. And with that, I'll take the pear-shaped tool to begin thinning the walls of this angular section of the bowl. I like blades that have this shape, as I can brace my thumb against it really quite firmly to add stability to my movement. And that's really what trimming's all about. You don't want to let the clay influence your movements. Instead, the tool should be held securely enough to cut through any slight undulations there could be in the walls of your pot. So far so good, although I think one side of this blade is sharper than the other. And please ignore those 2 spinning dots of white you can see on the pot. It's not plaster, but porcelain, that's worked its way into my reclaim, and inevitably it never gets fully mixed. But a few specks like this won't have much of an impact. Instead they'll just create very subtle light patches in the glaze that you'll barely be able to notice. This small, straight edge blade feels like it leaves a slightly neater surface, one that doesn't chatter quite so much. To clean up this trimmed surface and to remove the worst of the turning marks, I switch to a flat metal rib and scrape over the surface. And then, just to do a bit of burnishing, as the surface was looking quite rough, I use one of those blunt steel tools and just let it glide over the surface, and you can see the difference as the clay goes from being matte to glossy like it is now. With the walls done, I'm going to use this flat edge turning tool to trim the foot. I don't know if you'll be able to see this in the video, but I certainly felt it. Whilst the tip of this blade is really sharp, the actual length of it isn't quite straight. The tip leans to one side slightly, which means the trimmed surface, if the tool is used like a guide, like I normally do, will never be straight. and as my pots rely so much on straight lines, this could be a bit of a nuisance, but it's not the end of the world. I simply know that I can't rely on the shape of the blade to transfer the shape I want into the clay, but that's fine. I can do it by eye, and I found myself switching back to this smaller blade as it is perfectly straight and very sharp. I was able to trim down further than I thought, which means I've got this strange ledge just at the top of the foot, so I need to fix that before hollowing out the thick disc of clay on the bottom of this bowl. So the spin is removed, and then the first thing I do is normally turn this surface flat. Sometimes I find small chunks of bisque-fired clay, especially in stoneware that's been reclaimed and recycled, and really this is the best place I could have found it, as I'll be removing most of the material from this portion anyway. But that doesn't stop me from plugging it with a small piece of soft clay, as otherwise, when I continue trimming, the turning tool would fall into this crevice on each rotation, and this irregular motion could very quickly cause me to trim an uneven surface. Next, the outer portion of the foot is beveled, creating a point of contact that's less likely to chip. And finally, my favourite part, the hollowing out of the footwell. I'll begin this process with one of the Tungsten Carbide turning tools, but I can only use this to a certain depth, as there'll come a point, due to the angle I have to hold the tool, where the blade's cutting edge will really struggle to remove any material. And so I switch back to my trusty foot turning tool, which is made of steel, but it has a very sharp, flat blade, which means I can press it in almost horizontally and it easily slices through the stoneware. Whereas the tungsten blade is relatively thick and needs to be held at roughly a 45-degree angle for it to work, which I simply can't do in a foot that's going to be as deep as this. I know that a tungsten carbide tool that was as thin as the steel one would be really impractical, as it's a very brittle material, but I think a tool like this with a sharp thin blade in tungsten carbide is more or less the tool of my dreams. Anyway, steel or tungsten, both have their uses, and one isn't really better than the other. In fact, when it comes to turning, I think it's ultimately your experience that makes the biggest difference, as you could hand me some really shoddy, blunt turning tools, and I'd still be able to trim a pot like this with them. It may take longer, but it's possible. As I trim, I occasionally press on the base very gently, and I'm looking for movement. If it bows in ever so slightly, then I know I need to stop turning, otherwise I'll make the base too thin. But if I press down on it and it feels really solid, and there's no movement at all, then I know I can keep going. When turning the feet of my pots, I trim them so that the internal base of the foot matches the height of the wall on the other side of it. This is both from a visual, aesthetic standpoint, and at the same time it helps to ensure that the thickness of the walls are consistent throughout the pot, as if too much excess clay is left inside this internal portion of the foot, then the likelihood of the base splitting or cracking is much higher. Next, I burnish the very top of the foot, or actually the very bottom of it, as this ring of stoneware will be the only bare clay that's left on the pot after it's been glazed and fired, so it needs to be finished neatly. I then stamp the foot with my maker's mark, while simultaneously compressing the foot from either side with my finger and thumb. This way the clay doesn't splay out too much. With the foot trimmed, I spend a few moments just looking over the vessel to see whether there's anything I can improve upon. In this case, I just burnish the foot a touch more and define the underside of this ledge towards the rim. And with that, those securing lugs of clay can be peeled off and the vessel carefully lifted away by the foot. If you are doing this, please make sure your foot is dry enough, as if it's too soft and you grasp the foot, like I did, you could easily distort it, making it oval. The last thing I noticed is that there were a few rough patches on the rim, and so to fix that, I quickly tap center the bowl, place a spinner inside which I can apply downward pressure through. This holds the bowl in place, and then I can burnish the rim with the smooth portion of a plastic kidney. And that's the bowl finished, trimmed mostly with these. So thank you so much, Kamil, for sending these to me. The tools really work. They're a tiny bit rough in patches, but considering it's your first ever batch, that's completely normal. And the second, third and fourth batches will only get better, neater, the blades more consistent, but fundamentally they do work well already. I wasn't sure how critical to be with my feedback, but considering he's selling these at a similar price point as compared to other tool makers, and he's entered an environment where he's selling these to the public, I think this has been a useful video to make, and it led to learning a lot about the tungsten blanks, where they're produced, who makes them, and so on. All of which I wasn't going to initially talk about in this video, but at the same time, if I left it out, I think that would be even stranger. The last thing I do for these trim pots is loosely cover them with plastic. This way they'll dry slowly in my drafty studio. If I did leave them out, I'd want to make sure that the air can get around them evenly, as with these thinly walled pots, if one side dries out faster than the other, it can in some cases cause quite a severe distortion. Anyhow, thank you so much for taking the time to watch, and thanks Kamil for sending me those tools. I'll cherish and use them. They'll have a good home with me here.